Well, hello again. This is Strategic Visions with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I'm Stan Grant, just fixing my earpiece here so that we can hear everybody. Tonight we'll be discussing, I think this is probably one of the most subscribed and most eagerly anticipated sessions, looking at the state of the world through the lens of intelligence and security. We know that these are extraordinary times. Some are calling this era a new Cold War. We know that the rise of China is presenting enormous challenges to the world, particularly us here in Australia. But of course, there is the US relationship with China. There is the role of Russia in the world, the ongoing threat of terrorism, and of course, coronavirus as well. Two fantastic guests to join us this evening: Duncan Lewis, the former Director General of Security, ASIO, a former diplomat and an army officer as well, and Sir John Scarlett, former Chief of the British Intelligence Service, MI6, and former Chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. It's wonderful to have both of you with us. Thank you for joining us. I really wanted to start, I suppose, from both of you. And Sir John, I'll begin with you. If you could give us your overview of where we are right now, what this moment presents for us, and what the challenges are. If you're looking at security, intelligence, what the challenges of this moment are.
Right. Well, Stan, thank you, and I'm pleased to be here. Interesting discussion, certainly, with Duncan. The challenges are, I mean, they're fairly clear. I don't think there'll be a great surprise here. The fundamental challenge is what is called the return of great power competition. And of course that, in effect, in almost everybody's minds, means China and the United States, although if you want to annoy the Russians, then you don't include them, but so it is necessary to include them as well. And I think that's fair enough as in terms of international impact and global impact. And so, it's the form that competition is taking, and what the impact and the effect and the risks are with that competition, to what extent we actually understand it. Because of course, and I think you referred there to the Cold War, and the analogy is made with the Cold War, and of course the analogy is also made in particular circumstances, and I think Kevin Rudd has just recently written about this, builds up to 1914 and so on. But of course, one of the things about history is that it never repeats itself exactly. And so one has to be careful about historical analogies. I have to admit that I spent quite a bit of time on Cold War issues during the Cold War, and the fundamental difference between what was happening then and what's happening now is that China is a major economic success story and a growing still economic and regional and global power. And so the balance of forces between the United States and the Western world on the one hand, and China and the extent to which it leads to community or authoritarian states, that balance is not the same. And that makes a fundamental difference to what this means and how it's going to be developed into the future. And it's really a question, as I would put it, of authoritarian states and liberal democracies, and the authoritarian states are very assertive. In addition to that, of course, a few years ago, we've been having this discussion. We've been talking about non-state actors the whole time, and we've been talking about international terrorism, and we've all almost been nostalgic for the Cold War. The non-state actors and the terrorist threat has not gone away. I mean, it's simply not gone away. And if you talk to, I think, security services in any of our partner countries, they will confirm that, as well as our intelligence services, and the threat levels remain high. And there's been a lot of terrorist activity, certainly in the United Kingdom. 2017, 5 major attacks which were successful, and many others which were disrupted. And so that is an issue, and making sure we're understanding it and we're still able to talk about it and educate people about it is very, very important. And then, of course, the backdrop to all of that is technology and the impact of technological change on the intelligence and security community and the work that we do as we try to deal with these great big challenges. And technology is in itself a challenge, not always a negative challenge. You know, it brings with it disadvantages and threats and difficulties, new technology, but it also brings opportunities. Obviously, it's just changing the way the world is. And as a bit of an amateur historian, I'd simply make the point that, and as a former chairman at Bletchley Park, the wartime code breaking centre, if you look at what happened in the era of technological change in the run-up to 1914 and during the First World War and so on, and you can see how this can really transform the situation in which, in particular, the intelligence world lives. So in that sense, history is a guide, no more than a guide, but it's a guide. And then I think the final thing I'd just say is that I just made a remark in our pre-conversation that one big change is in public profile of the intelligence and security communities. I spent the first 20 years of my career working for an organization which didn't exist. And you know, nobody talked about it. There was no legislation really which were related to it directly, and so on. And now it has a very high public profile, and for all sorts of reasons, and we can go into them, is a matter of great sort of debate in a sort of liberal democracy and a law-based society. How do you get that balance right between protecting people's security and recognizing and protecting their privacy? Very complicated issue and another very big challenge, changing all the time. I'll stop there.
Yeah, Duncan Lewis, Sir John raised the issue there of history and what we can learn from history. And there is that old saying, isn't there, that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. As a way of framing your comments and your assessment of this moment that we're in right now, is this historically analogous to the run-up to 1914? Some have also talked about the 1930s and seeing issues here that very much mirror what we saw with the rise of fascism and, of course, the drift to World War II.
Stan, yes, thank you. Look, good evening to you, and could I compliment ASPI on running this event. It's great to be on with Sir John. John and I are colleagues from way back, and it's a great privilege to be here. I would like to identify with what John has said with regard to great power rivalry. I think those comments that he made at the beginning are comments that I would agree with entirely. I am a subscriber to the theory that while history doesn't repeat, it does rhyme. I think there is learning to be had from history, which you can apply to the current day. And there are quite a number of features of history in the early part of the last century, the first sort of quarter of the last century, which do have some resonance today. So I think that's worth just noting. But I'm always leery about the notion of history repeating itself. Let me make some remarks. Firstly, a general comment about intelligence and the future. There has always been intelligence effort put in by governments and by mankind since the recorded history began. And there's nothing different about where it's going to go in the future. We've had intelligence gathering and intelligence production for a very good reason in the past, and I think we will have it well into the future. This is particularly so because governments are increasingly faced with complex situations, and intelligence, of course, while it can't provide all of the answers, it does retire some of the risk in terms of decision making, and so governments find it attractive. So to be frank, business is looking pretty brisk. Now, there are four drivers of change that I think will impact the intelligence community. The first one is the strategic environment, which we've discussed. The issue of great power rivalry, the fact that the tectonic plates of geostrategic power have been shifting. Now, this is long before COVID, I might add. They've been shifting for some years. And I might just make the observation that if COVID has and is doing anything, it is accelerating those changes. So I think it's acting as an accelerant. Whether and to what extent it produces outcomes of its own, I think is yet to be seen. But I must say, the money is on COVID creating some discontinuities in the geostrategic circumstances of the world going forward. I think the economy, the impact on the economy is going to drive some political change. The second thing that I would say, the first thing being strategic environment, the second environmental change is technological, and John has mentioned this. Intelligence agencies collect and they analyse. On the collection side, we have new means of collection, and in particular, the digital world has provided a complete change in the way in which human beings engage with one another. Almost all of us now have a digital footprint of some sort. That footprint is global, it's instantaneous, it is indelible, and it's very discoverable in most cases. So that's a challenge. On the analytical side of the house, we have mass data. We have huge amounts of data which have not been available in the past, huge data sets. That will require the application of artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning, and deep learning. Those three things will be applied to this mass data and big data in the future. And we are going to have to produce intelligence at machine speed. I think that's what is going to be different perhaps to in the past. Machine speed will be critical. The third environmental change, I think, Stan, is legislative. Governments, certainly in this country, have made great progress with legislative initiatives over the last 10 years or so. The counter-terrorism environment was the driver initially, but that now has swung onto the counter-espionage and foreign interference area. And those legislative measures such as EFI, the Espionage and Foreign Interference Act, FITS, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, they're emblematic, and they show how governments are having to adjust, and legislation must keep up with evolving sort of circumstances. That raises the issue, of course, of this difficult relationship between the community and the government, between the individual and the government. There's almost a paradox here. The government has an obligation to protect, but of course the individual has a right to privacy and to liberty. And so trying to square that circle, and I think it can be squared, I might add, I think that's very doable, but that's a discussion that's underway. And Stan, finally, the last environment that I think is going to be impacted is what I've described as workforce. I think there's a big challenge for the intelligence communities with workforce. We are still trying to settle what kind of workforce we want. We sort of have an idea, I suspect. Well, I don't suspect, we do. We have an idea of what we want, but trying to actually nail that down and then produce that workforce, particularly given competition right across the business and commercial sector and across the community, and issues to do with gender equity. When ASIO was formed in 1949, we had 13 officers. They were all men. Now the organisation sits at about 2,000 and nearly half are women. So there's some big changes going on with regard to our workforce, and we need to keep working that. Stan, I'm going to stop it there, but they're my sort of opening observations.
A lot to work through, and I think I'll start with the big question that both of you have raised here. And so, John, I'll go to you first on this, and that is the question of what a return to great power rivalry means. We got a bit of a taste of that in the lead up to COVID with the trade war between China and the United States. We know that there is an increasing nationalism in the world today, and that's challenging to a multilateral order. Does a return to great power politics mean the end of what we've grown accustomed to post-World War II, what we've called a liberal global order? And if that is the case, what replaces that?
Well, the liberal global order, which, as it were, now, when we look back, we're sort of very conscious of, maybe we took it rather for granted or looked at it in a different way during the Cold War or whatever, is clearly under challenge. Now, whether it's under a deliberate challenge is maybe the key issue. But if you look at some of the things which are said and policies which are followed, particularly by the Chinese People's Republic and by the Russian Federation. I mean, there is an almost explicit and open challenge to the United States-led liberal world order. I mean, I'm particularly conscious of it coming from Moscow, and I sort of understand it because it's all tied up, of course, with patriotism and national ambition and so on. But the sort of rules-based liberal world order is under challenge, and of course one of the reasons it is under challenge is because the rules were formulated by the United States and the Western world in the aftermath of World War II, and the Soviet Union in a way was never quite, never an integrated member of the sort of global order during all those years, not least the global economy. And of course that's just completely different now. So it's much more complicated. And I think we need to be clear about that, and that goes back to my reference to authoritarian regimes. I mean, clearly there is a fundamental difference between the forms of governance in authoritarian states, maybe particularly China, and what we see in the United Kingdom or in Australia. And it is pointless to pretend that that's not the case. And that has implications for everything, the way we live, our values, our privacy, and everything else, which of course is very much added to by the technological issues we were just talking about. Now, I'd say that certainly for much of the time, my last years in government service and in the profession, I mean, we did spend all of time thinking about terrorism and international non-state actors. And when I look back on it, I think I, anyway, was taking a lot for granted when it came to the rise of Chinese global power. But I did have an understanding. I didn't really understand the country very well, don't speak Chinese. But I did have an understanding that inevitably a rising power, economic power, with a history like that, was going to need to express that power in terms of diplomacy and in terms of military expression and in terms of regional security and safety and influence and so on. And of course that in the last 10 years is what has happened. And it's the extent to which it's gone. So you've got the combination of the authoritarian approach and the sort of fundamentally different approach to governance, coupled with, good old-fashioned territorial ambition and expression, and the development and exercise of, I mean, it's not old-fashioned military power in the sense that it's very modernized and being invested in very heavily now, but still it takes quite a territorial and regional influence form. Immediately, certainly that's clear, obviously in the Indo-Pacific and in the so and that's easier for you to understand in Australia than it is for many people in the United Kingdom and in Europe, I have to say. I referred earlier on to Kevin Rudd and his article and the references to 1914 and so on. When I read it, I felt, well, I'm always wary of comparisons to 1914 for the reasons we've spelled out, and I sort of worry when I see that being expressed. But I mean, obviously, you don't have to be a strategic genius to see the risks in the South China Sea, or in particular around Taiwan. You absolutely don't. And so the intelligence issues and challenges there are absolutely clear. I'd make one other point here, actually, if I can, that this goes back to what intelligence is about, really, or how someone like me, anyway, and probably Duncan, I'll see what he thinks, what do we mean when we talk about intelligence? And to me, of course, that means secrets, essentially. If it's available in some non-secret and non-covert way, then I'm not even sure it's intelligence. I mean, it is in a way, but it's data. It's information is out there. So it's information that people don't want you to find out and don't want you to know, and it's tricky to get it. And a key objective of such intelligence search, if you like, is I've always seen as your sort of key objective in that area, and this is relating to great power politics and so on, is getting into the mind of the other side. We ended up being quite good at that in the Soviet Union eventually. But to what extent are we into the mind of the other side when it comes to the Standing Committee of the Politburo in 2020, and when we're talking about objectives for South China Sea, Taiwan, or whatever else it might be?
You've really raised something here with these big questions about our global order, the rise of authoritarianism, what this means for the world. There are so many questions and comments coming in about that. And Duncan, I might get a bit specific. When we talk about the rise of authoritarianism, we can very much talk about China. China, it's a very complicated situation because you have an avowedly authoritarian country that is also part of the global order. It is a permanent 5-member of the UN Security Council. It is in the World Trade Organization. It is on the way to being, if it's not already by some measurements, the biggest economy in the world. It is indispensable. It is interconnected. What challenges then does that pose for the order? Is it about incorporating China even more, releasing the historical hold that the West has had on the institutions of power, the World Bank, the IMF and other things, and being able to incorporate China, or indeed to push back against China? How do we manage this at the moment by maintaining a global order, but acknowledging that part of the threat is already inside the tent, if you like? Yeah,
Stan, the question you pose is, of course, the central issue, really, from a strategic point of view that we are all grappling with. The notion of developing what I described as, we were talking about it earlier, the middle road, of having some sort of middle road, because it's not a binary thing necessarily with China. I mean, the Bretton Woods world order that was established in the wake of World War II clearly doesn't suit, if you like, some of the modern developments of power balances. And so there has to be, and there has been, but there needs to be more accommodation to ensure that the reality of where power lies is managed. We do need a world order, however, and this is important. I mean, 2,000 years ago, Thucydides told us that the strong will do as they will and the weak will suffer as they must. Now, a sound world order with respect for the rule of international law is the thing that separates us from sort of barbarism and the wanton application of force. So from an Australian point of view, it's hugely important that the rules are understood, that they are fair and just, and they are followed. So how do we square this circle? Because we do have, without question, if not emerging, perhaps even an emerged China. I mean, the Chinese now are certainly pushing on a number of fronts, whether it be territorial or whether it be ideological or whatever it happens to be. And in a way, that's to be expected. I'm not necessarily hugely critical of that. I mean, I understand that as China emerges as a great power, it is going to require space to move and to pursue its interests. And it's quite legitimate that China pursues its interests. But it must be done within this framework of what are the accepted international norms. And that really is the thing that Australian governments and governments around the world have been struggling with. What is interesting is in the last few months, I think there's an increasing awareness that if we are going to defend those things that we hold dear, and we must have a searing focus on what it is that we're trying to defend here. Those values that we hold so dear will need to be defended collectively. It can't be done just with one country and then another country, and it needs to be done as a collective. The countries who have shared interests, shared values, need to identify where those crossover points are and work in concert. Now, you used the words a moment ago, should we be pushing back on China? I don't see acting in concert as necessarily pushing back on China. It is making sure that we are very clear on what it is that we are trying to protect.
And in terms of that, Sir John, we may not see it as pushing back, but the Chinese may. And the Chinese are very sensitive to any, what they see as any attempt at containment. And there will be consequences. And we've seen those consequences. We've seen that in recent times with Australia. There have been trade consequences because of decisions that Australia has made. But in terms of what we are defending, of what we are protecting, and how we do that against a power that may be disruptive, but is demanding its place and will respond in its own way. How do we do that?
Right. Well, I very much agree with what Duncan has just said. We have to be careful here. We'll end up agreeing about everything. We mustn't do that. That's fine. I very much agree with that. We have to be, first of all, absolutely clear about what it is that we're defending. And of course, that, again, goes back to how an intelligence and security service, structure is bound and has to look at things. And so that means, of course, we're defending our countries. We're defending our countries as liberal democracies based on the rule of law. And we use the term liberal democracy rather often now, but it's not often explained exactly what a liberal democracy is and what it stands for. And so a law-based society, protecting the rights of individuals to lead their lives freely whilst keeping them safe, is a sort of an attempt to sort of go a bit further. But obviously you could debate this for a long time. But making sure that you're doing that is essential. Now that's going to bring in and require decisions of the kind that the Australian government has been making, and the kind that the British government has just recently made, for example, after a great deal of public debate around 5G.
Huawei.
Huawei. Now, when that happens, then of course you get pushback, if you like, or you risk getting pushback from China, and then you have to think, well, to what extent is that pushback, predictable and understandable, and how do you deal with it? And here, I think, what I'm thinking when I see this happening is that we, in an ideal world, we would just understand each other much better than we do. It seems at the moment. It seems very difficult to explain to decision makers in Beijing that, let's say, the worries and reactions and responses around Huawei and the 5G really, they're not hard to explain. I mean, the worries are clearly there, and they're to do with national security and national protection. And they're exactly the same worries that they would have perfectly rationally in Beijing. But to what extent is the pushback because it's just a pushback because it's annoying, what's happening around Huawei, or to what extent is the pushback based on a really serious misunderstanding and failure to understand what motivates decision making in our countries and in our societies. And in order to get that right, you have to talk with each other, you have to have dialogue, you have to develop the best possible mutual understanding, whilst at the same time defending yourself. And that means having good mutual understanding, which goes back to intelligence.
Can we just, Duncan, define, though, how we see this threat and the language that we use around this? You've said before, the Chinese government is seeking to, quote, take over Australia's political system through its insidious foreign interference operations. That is not just something that you can negotiate away. There's not something you can deal with by talking. You've talked about the legislative approach that we've made so far, but in terms of defining the threat, is China a malign threat in the region and directly, in this case, to Australia?
Yeah, Stan, just to qualify, the headline that was in the newspaper was as you described. The fine print in what I actually said in that interview really concentrated on the fact that we just needed to be careful in this country, and I think in any liberal democracy, that you don't go to sleep at the wheel, because you could wake up further down the track in the ditch. And I think this is an issue for us. We need to be constantly vigilant to ensure that when influence, and we're talking about really interference here. There is a big difference, of course, between influence and interference. There is nothing wrong with influence. Governments have been trying to influence the activities of other governments for
control is another thing, and I think using the word control, that insidious,
yes,
really is a very, very different framing of this than just influence, isn't it?
Oh yes, because this is to do with interference. It's a different game altogether. And where there is interference, that is intolerable. And it must be detected and eliminated in whichever country it's occurring. Now, we in Western democracies, liberal democracies, are particularly vulnerable because of the nature of our society. So, and in Australia, we were discussing earlier, if you have a look at the demographics in Australia, the extraordinary number of Australians that are from cultures overseas, that are foreign born. I think it's something like 27% of Australians are born outside of the country. In the United States, that figure is 17%. So we have a very, very varied and mixed demographic here. And of course, if you're an intelligence agency and you look at organisations such as John's former agency, working through that sort of diaspora is very attractive. You've automatically got a base from which you can work. Now, this is a very sensitive issue because you have to be enormously careful not to alienate and isolate those small or those demographic minorities that are in the country, but they are a vector through which foreign governments can act. And I'm not singling out China in this regard. This applies to all diasporas.
Well, you had to encounter that, of course, at the height of the terrorist activity post 9/11. That was also front and center, and it is. You've highlighted it's very sensitive, isn't it? When
It's
you talk
very
about
sensitive.
a diaspora, they can very easily be marginalised, targeted, and we've seen the consequences of that. And they can also be an asset.
Oh yes, and we certainly found that in the case of the terrorists. So I don't want to stray off the subject of great power rivalry for the time being. We'll probably come to terrorism, but in the instance of my organisation at the time, ASIO, pursuing the terrorist threat in this country, we were aided enormously by the Islamic community. I mean, that community knows what's going on in their particular community. And so you do rely very heavily on these diasporas. And apart from that, it's quite wrong to start demonising sections of your community when it's not warranted. So I think it's a very sensitive area. We've got to be very careful as we move forward.
But would you identify aspects of the Chinese diaspora as potentially part of that insidious effort to interfere or control?
Yes. Yes, without question, because of the reasons that I've said. That a diaspora community is a very attractive proposition from the point of view of any intelligence agency trying to influence, trying to gain influence. I mean, you work through that community as a vector. And so you need to be very mindful of that. I think we see with interference here in Australia, there is a clash of culture that the Chinese government seems to find the sort of level of tolerance here to be a surprise. We should not and we must not tolerate that sort of interference in Australia. When it occurs, it needs to be identified and stopped. And I spent a lot of my time in the closing days of my Director Generalship of ASIO focused on this issue. But Stan, it is a very sensitive matter, and it needs to be treated with due caution.
I'll come to you, Sir John, just in a moment. But just to clarify that, Duncan, how serious is the threat? How would you characterise it at the moment? Is it low level? Is it significant? If you're talking about infiltration of a diaspora for these ends, how would you characterise it right now as it presents itself? How significant a threat is it?
Yeah, I mean, I used the word for a number of years of unprecedented. I mean, everyone bandies that word around these days, but it did have application here. It was unprecedented, but noting that it was coming off a very low base, and I think that's important. So we came from a situation where there was virtually no interference to a position where there now is interference. Let me make one other observation, Stan. This is hugely important. Why do governments interfere in the business of others? Now, they're always trying to get influence and get outcomes that are favourable to themselves. But what has changed? Technology has changed. Governments are now, if they wish to follow a malign course, able to influence and to interfere in the business of others. It's much easier now because of the technological platforms that are available. Social media, that's a whole discussion in itself. You know, the whole issue of fake news, the interference in elections, you can see all of these things stacking up one after another, but they're all technologically based. And governments now can interfere because the means are there to do it in a way that was not possible before.
Are we dealing with that effectively? You look at United Front, and for instance, you know, these the sort of propaganda work groups. Are we effective right now? Is the government on top of this?
I think the government is doing a great job. I mean, I think we are, by international standards, pretty much on guard here. I mean, we've had a fair bit of notice. There's been instances that have occurred here, which we've been able to shine a light on. Now, a lot of this stuff, Stan, will never see the light of day because of the sensitive nature of it, of course. It's not going to be a matter of sort of public disclosure. But I think there is enough in the public domain to show that we have been managing the threat of foreign interference in Australia. But it's going to require a lot of effort over a long period of time to ensure that those core values that I mentioned before that we are trying to protect are in fact protected. But it is essential that we zero in on what it is precisely we're trying to protect, because if we run around trying to protect things that possibly don't matter in the longer term, we'll exhaust ourselves. We need to be searingly focused.
So John, I'll put that question to you as well. We've been speaking very specifically about Australia, and there are, you know, this is very front and centre for Australia because of our deep trade ties with China. But what about in the UK as well? You mentioned the Huawei decision and how that is received by the Chinese Communist Party. But to the same extent, are you concerned about activity of the Chinese diaspora, of infiltration of the diaspora? Would you use similar language if you're talking about the British political landscape and intelligence landscape, that there are efforts by the Chinese Communist Party, insidious efforts to interfere or control? Would you go that far?
Well, coming at it from a slightly different angle to start with, I just want to make the link between the diaspora that you've been discussing there and what we were previously saying about authoritarian regimes. And of course, the issue here is that a very authoritarian regime, you know, appears to have a completely sort of directed approach to exploitation of the diaspora. Sometimes to be regarded, you know, as if they're sort of citizen soldiers in some way, and one sees examples of that all the time. So it's the combination of the two things, which is the difficulty, and it is a particular issue, of course, for Australia for the reasons we've been discussing. I'd say that from the outside, or sort of semi-outside, when I've been watching this over the last few years, since I left government service, but I also, when I was still in government service, watching Australia's reaction to this and response to it, particularly in recent years, it's been, I would say, pretty impressive. And you know, that's what I say to people when they ask me about it. There is an absolutely clear, you know, policy directed and operationally directed response to the problem. I'm not saying that it's solving the problem, but you know, that is there. Now, and I think that's quite widely recognised. In the UK, or maybe in Europe and so on, and also to some extent in the United States, it's more complicated. I mean, your question there referred to Chinese diaspora and Chinese influence in business, or then maybe by extension in politics and so on. And the situation with us is I think, but I'm not claiming to be an enormous expert here, is more complicated. Because we're a lot further away, and the integration of the economies and so on is much less profound. And there's a much lower level of understanding, really, in sort of British politics and British public life of this issue. And one of the points about the Huawei issue is that it brought that into very sharp focus, but into a system which is not really completely adapted to it. Because, of course, famously, just a few years ago, we had the leaders of the government talking about a new golden era in relations and so on. And this has all become part of a heated political debate now, where of course, in our case, we face many of the same issues, but with regard to Russia, and I don't know whether you want
we'll discuss Russia, yes,
or not, but I mean, obviously, that's a more immediate issue for the UK. And there, I mean, we've just recently had a report published by the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is the Parliamentary Oversight Committee for the Intelligence and Security Community, which before 1993 didn't exist, I have to say, because of course the services didn't exist, and that's been very critical of the readiness and capability and just general awareness of the sort of government and the intelligence and security community, and the quality of the response to what is perceived at various levels as Russian interference in our economy and in our decision making and in our politics. And of course, that's a huge subject.
To what extent, Sir John, are they aligned too? Because of course we are seeing, an increasing Sino-Russian alliance in the world. Those two countries much closer together. So when you talk about Russian interference, are you also talking about an alignment of China and Russia for their own interests as well?
No, I'm not. Be clear.
Just very specifically.
Duncan may correct me, but China doesn't do alliances, I think, in that way.
No, I agree with that.
And certainly not with Russia. I mean, there obviously is a comparison and a degree of collaboration and cooperation, particularly at the UN Security Council and that kind of thing, and in various aspects of international relations between China and Russia. But it doesn't go deep into the system, in my experience. And indeed, I think if you talk to many Russian colleagues and ask them what they're really worried about for the future, they might tell you privately that they worry about China. Of course, at the top government level, what both sides worry about is the United States. And it's that shared worry which brings them together in the big international arena.
Well, let's talk about the United States as well, Duncan. And one of the criticisms during the Trump era has been what's perceived to be damage to those alliances, the criticism of NATO, criticism of Australia at times as well, an increasing America first, go it alone. Has that, in your view, has damage been done to the necessary alliances to thwart the spread of influence of authoritarianism in China?
I don't think so, Stan. I'm a sort of glass half full on the issue of the United States and its alliances. There's no question that those alliances, almost without exception, have taken a buffeting over the last 4 years. There's no question about that. But when I was the ambassador to NATO 7 or 8 years ago, there was a constant string of criticism from the United States about their European allies of not spending enough on defence and so forth. So there's something rather traditional about that. Now, the relationships are old and deep, and I think they're strong enough to sustain the kind of buffeting that they unquestionably have had over the last 4 years. I think we do need to be careful going forward. The United States has now, in my view, very clearly identified that it has in China a peer competitor, and there are issues, interests that the United States has that it will need to protect. There is some accommodation that will have to be made with regard to China. But these are matters of great focus in Washington. And I think that people who sort of regard Washington as having a rather a simplistic view of the world misunderstand what's going on in that city. The United States administration, whether it be this one or any of its predecessors, has a very sophisticated understanding of what's happening in the world. And I'm confident that the current buffeting, and I accept that, I really do. I think it's been unfortunate. It's not helpful. It's something you've got to manage. But I think, and I'm sure that John would agree with me, we know enough senior American officials, and we've dealt with enough senior American officials over the years to know that the country will continue to be a world power. There is no question about that. But its relationship with China has changed, and I think it will continue to change. And that's going to be, the acme of success will be how that's managed. It's my view that countries like Australia, and it's not for me to speak on behalf of other allies, but in the case of Australia, we need to continue at this time to lean very heavily forward into that alliance and support the United States, because that is in our interests. Countries follow their interests. Our interests are in the alliance with the United States remaining strong, and the United States remaining a very active and powerful player in the Indo-Pacific region.
So, John, is that your assessment too of the United States? Of course, it is still, by many measures, the biggest military in the world, still a pivotal power in the world. But is it a damaged power in the world after endless conflict, Iraq and Afghanistan, and the global financial crisis of 2008, how dreadfully hard it's been hit by COVID-19, the Trump years, an increasing isolationism or an America First attitude, and deep political polarization inside the country? Is it still the force that it was in the world, vis-a-vis, of course, a potentially durable and viable strategic challenge from China?
Okay, well, undoubtedly, at the moment, and after 3+ years of the America First, as it were, administration, there is a degree of disorientation, amongst America's allies, and within the alliances, and more generally around the world. I mean, as I travel around, or at least I did travel around pre-COVID, or everywhere I went, almost the first question you'd be asked was, well, what's going on in the United States? And what I came away thinking from comments like that was, okay, people talk about the United States as being in decline, but if it was really in decline, why does everybody talk about it all the time? There's not a country in the world that isn't affected in some way or another by American decision-making and US policy-making and so on. And that just goes to show the true extent of US and continuing extent of US power. I think that's the first point I'd make there. The second point is that, again, seen through my eyes and just watching it, I'd say that if you look back 2 or 3 years, certainly to 2018, that was the moment when attitudes within the US towards China sort of almost visibly and audibly changed. Right the way across, it wasn't actually a particular issue necessarily just with the Trump administration. It was across the political spectrum, and certainly with the intelligence and security community and defense community, an explicit awareness that the United States was facing a challenge, a global challenge on a different scale from what it had faced before, including in technology and advanced technology, where of course they were not expecting that to happen, and they were certainly not used to it. And then, of course, that's developed subsequently in the ways that we've seen. I think it's quite a profound change. I think it is important to sort of keep calm about it. And obviously, a lot goes back to the America First administration, and we don't know, whether that's going to continue or not. And we're in the last 3 months now before the election, and everybody's waiting to see what happens there. And there's a lot of emotion attached to that. But I have to say that maybe it's just because of my personal experience and background, but for a very long time I've worked very, very closely, and my colleagues have, with a whole range of US colleagues and senior people in the administration and politics, but above all in the security and intelligence community, and they're absolutely rock solid in their commitment to the alliances, in their commitment to NATO, in their commitment to the Five Eyes, in their commitment to liberal democracy and American leadership internationally.
Duncan, just on Five Eyes, let's talk about that and its role right now. What are your thoughts on that? And I suppose during COVID as well, it's front and center, that ability to share information, intelligence, so all of those things have come very much to the fore. But the role of Five Eyes right now, and also as a follow-up to that, and I'll put this to Sir John as well, expansion of Five Eyes.
I think Five Eyes is showing in recent days its true value. We have known for the last 40 or 50 years the strength of this relationship. I mean, it's longer than that actually, but like John, I have been involved with the Five Eyes community basically all my working life, and the strength of that organisation is unique in the world. It is not repeated anywhere else between a range of countries. The closeness and the extent of information exchange, intelligence exchange, decision-making exchange, and so on is without parallel. I think events of the recent couple of years, and now events of the last couple of months, to go to your COVID observation, is that the Five Eyes community is more valuable to its members than it has ever been. And so, look, I'm enormously positive about where this is going, and I think we need to make sure that nothing diminishes or erodes the value that each of us derive. And we do derive different levels of value in terms of our input, but for a country like Australia, which inputs a fair degree, we get a very good return in that relationship. Your last point, Stan, with regard to the expansion, we have discussions, and we've had discussions for some years, about whether Five Eyes has the scope for expansion to a Seven Eyes or a Nine Eyes or an 11 Eyes. I'm not sure that I didn't even hear a 13 Eyes. I'm not sure that I could list them all, but you're starting to get a multi-headed hydra at that point, I suspect, with a number of eyes. It comes back to interests. To what extent do the interests of those additional laminates, the 5, the 7, the 9, to what extent do those interests intersect? I think there's been a general trend of increasing intersection of interest. Certainly when I look at some of the Western European members there, there is a lot of intersection going on. We've managed it to date by having one or other or several of the Five Eyes community having bilateral, if you like, relationships with those additional eyes. So there are mechanisms by which this can be accommodated. But I would not want to see the Five Eyes community expand to a point where it somehow diluted or diminished the trust that exists, because it all depends entirely on trust.
Because there was a very good follow-up question to that, actually, someone raised, and that is that question of trust, of being able to share information without compromise.
Yeah.
So John, if we were talking about expansion, and we know that Five Eyes have cooperated with other countries like Japan, for instance, in the past, but there's one country. If you're talking about China front and center as a strategic competitor, challenge, or threat, Japan, India, Indonesia has been spoken of before, particularly with intelligence sharing around terrorist activities, which Australia already does with countries like Indonesia. But who would you nominate if indeed there was to be an expansion, and under what circumstances you believe an expansion could take place. And again, front and center, that question of trust.
Right. Well, can I just say quickly something about Five Eyes? Again, as an amateur historian, I'd go back to 1944, I think it was, and the Britain-USA Bruce agreement, the intelligence sharing agreement, which was there still during the war, and Australia and Canada and New Zealand, I'm embarrassed to say, sort of came into that as an automatic part of the British Dominions, as they were called at that time. And it's grown out of that. So there's a continuous history since 1944. So if my mathematics are right, so that's 76 years. Okay. And now it's only very recently that we've been able to have a discussion like this around the Five Eyes, if I've understood, if I remember correctly. And it's always been there. It was always a fundamental part of my work. And particularly when I was leader of the service and senior positions in the community, but it didn't have any public profile. And the public profile came out really with the Snowden revelations. At least that's my sort of understanding of it. I may not be quite right there. Now I find that carries risk, that public profile. When the Five Eyes for decades was an intelligence and security intelligence sharing relationship based absolutely, as you've just been saying, on trust. I mean, it's exactly the word I would use, complete trust. You just know that your partners are in no way going to be working against you or not in your interests in some way, and it's an honest relationship, and it's formed institutionally, historically, and individually. As soon as it became sort of public, it began to acquire a political profile, and people started, applying for membership. And without going into too much detail, I've had quite a few conversations with friends and so on from close friendly countries who've applied to join, and to which my answer is, I'm afraid, it's Five Eyes. It isn't Six Eyes, and it isn't Seven Eyes. End of subject. No expansion. I just can't see how it can be done.
Does that, though, raise a question in this changing landscape that we've talked about so much this evening? Does that, though, not raise a question about being fit for purpose in this changing landscape? And why couldn't we trust a country like Japan?
No, well, of course, Japan is a very trustworthy ally, but it's important not to, I think it's a risk that we can oversimplify this issue. I mean, countries and intelligence service and security service have allies and partners and friends all around the place. I mean, alliances in that way and intelligence alliances are a vital part of the work that you do, particularly if you're working globally, as increasingly we do. And, in my experience, really we have extremely close and trusting relationships with our big European partners, for example, with Japan is another example, and I can quote, of course, quite a number of other examples. But it's, in fact, France, for example, is our oldest intelligence and security ally. I can date it back to March 1911. But
not part of it, yeah.
Yeah, but and indeed, they don't want to be part of it, I don't think. It's not, I don't get requests from French friends. It's because they understand, they understand as very, very experienced people. They understand the reality of how these things are. And I mean, in the great sort of Brexit debates and so on, which have been happening over in my country in the last few years, there's been a tendency to say, well, it has been said actually by sort of politicians, well, we don't need the intelligence relationships with our European allies in the same way because we've got Five Eyes, and that's a sort of alternative. And it's a complete understanding. Yeah.
Sorry, Stan, I wonder if I might just add to John's comment that the point he made about Five Eyes not being in the public arena until comparatively recently, since it has kind of come out of the shadows, if you like, there has been a tendency for all sorts of other channels of interest to get on board. You know, the Five Eyes must be good because it's been going for so long in the intelligence world. So what we've discovered, I think, in the last few years is that if you have a look at ministerial meetings, for example, there had been no Five Eyes foreign ministers meetings, or indeed Five Eyes leaders meeting. The leaders of our five nations had never met in a Five Eyes environment. Defence ministers now meeting in Five Eyes, and I've noticed in recent years, of course, we've got Home Affairs, internal ministries meeting in that sort of configuration. So the trust that exists and has existed for, as John's pointed out, for more than 7 decades in the intelligence world, has been a platform upon which ministers and governments have tried to add. And I noticed the other day the COVID discussions are going down the same track, that there is discussions within that kind of, and I use Five Eyes quite carefully here. There are 5 nations that have been coming together to talk about these issues. And of course, it's branded very quickly as Five Eyes. So I think it is important that we distinguish between the absolute trust and the history of intelligence Five Eyes versus what is quite clearly common interest that exists between the 5 governments that are involved and other discussions that they might have.
Duncan, we have about half an hour left, and I want to get to a couple of other issues, but I just want to bring this sort of broad conversation to a point here, and that is to get your assessment of where we sit in terms of the danger of this moment. We've seen Australia release its new defence outline, its new defence posture, spending much more money. The concerns about the Indo-Pacific, the concerns about the South China Sea. You mentioned Thucydides before, and that Thucydides trap has been thrown around as the inevitability of a rising power, waning power, leading to a broader conflict. What's your assessment of the risk of real conflict, particularly in the Indo-Pacific right now?
It's pretty grim, Stan. In my 47 years of working life, I don't recall a time, and that goes back into the Cold War as well, but I don't recall a time when we've had so many moving parts, moving around at the one time. You've just worked through a list there of a whole range of issues that are burning right now. And I think the advent of COVID, as I mentioned before, it's acting as an accelerant. The actual effect that, not so much COVID itself, but the economic fallout from COVID, the impact that's going to have on the strategic and the geostrategic balances in the world, I think is yet to play out. But I've got to say that I'm kind of glass half empty around this right now. And I don't recall having been in that position before. But let me make one qualification. While I may consider it grim, I don't regard it in any way as being hopeless. It is, or inevitable. I think it's very, very wrong to consider that the current worrying trends will lead us inevitably to some sort of, cataclysmic conflict. I don't subscribe to that for a moment. I believe we just got to work harder. We should be working much harder diplomatically. We should be working much harder with all of our economic tentacles. We should be working, and when I say we, this is the royal we. This is all like-minded countries that are concerned about where this globe's going. We should be working harder, and that includes, I might add, those countries that are causing us concern. Not just China, but John's mentioned Russia. There are a whole host of countries in this world that are either showing signs of or are actually working outside of the rule of law as we understand it. And I think we need to be calling them out, and we need to be working very, very hard to try to land this thing without having some sort of massive conflict. So I'm confident we can do it, but the situation, you asked me for my assessment. My assessment of the current situation is that it's pretty grim.
Would that be yours, Sir John, as well? And what would you fear would be the trigger for that? We heard Duncan mention that the rule of law must be adhered to. Well, that China doesn't accept that rule of law, for instance, in the South China Sea. It didn't accept the ruling in The Hague. It defines that law very differently. Do you accept that grim outlook, and what do you fear would be a trigger for that?
Well, there's plenty to worry about. Mind you, there always is plenty to worry about. We tend to look back on the past as, oh, well, that was all right. The Cold War was all right because we won it, and we didn't, somehow it was always under control. Speaking as somebody who was involved in the latter part of it, I can think of quite a few moments when it definitely did not seem under control. And that one or two, I would say, are probably the most worrying experiences that I've lived through anytime, anywhere, including with what I see today. So, that's the first point. Remember that, you know what happened in history, and of course you worry more about the future because you don't know what's going to happen there. That's always how it is. And you have to keep your brain in place there. So I'm not sort of lying awake at night worrying about this all the time. On the other hand, there are things to worry about. There are specific issues to worry about. I'll just sort of, I think it's important not to forget the sort of the Russia issue, if you like, because Russia remains an assertive, very powerful in military terms country with quite a mission to assert itself, on the global scene and to recover from what is perceived as a historical humiliation in their case back in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's a very big driver. And I could go into lots of detail about maritime activity and other forms of activity and political activity to back that up. But I think it's probably best to highlight China here. And there are 2 points I'd make. First of all, quite obviously the military maneuvers and tensions, South China Sea, I'd say particularly Taiwan, maybe. It's longer term, but it's a very emotional issue. And that's what tends sometimes to cause unpredictable behavior. Coupled with the fact that I at least still don't really understand what is driving Chinese activity and Chinese policy. And in particular, as Duncan is mentioning, in the context of COVID-19 and the post-COVID period, during the current COVID period, China is being assertive. And to what extent is that deliberate? To what extent is it not? And this goes back, of course, to my fundamental intelligence point: is getting into the mind of the other side. How do they discuss these issues in the standing committee? What exactly is the ultimate objective and indeed timelines around the South China Sea and Taiwan and so on? To what extent do they understand that the way they've been pushing so openly in the last few years has caused this potentially really damaging to them a reaction, amongst the Western liberal democracies? I don't know the answer to those things.
Duncan, you've mentioned COVID a couple of times and seen that as an accelerant to some of the tensions that we're seeing throughout the world right now, but particularly when it comes to civil liberties, surveillance, intelligence, control over our lives. We are all living through this extraordinary time where to go to work is illegal in some parts of Australia and other parts of the world. Is this, this of course comes after 9/11 and the increasing powers of intelligence and surveillance into the lives of individuals. Is this the new normal? Is this what we now accept forever and a day? This increasing encroachment onto liberty, human rights, civil liberties, and greater surveillance of our lives?
Stan, I hope desperately personally that it's not the new normal, but I suspect that technology is driving both governments and the citizens of that those governments represent into almost a pact. Let me put it another way. It seems unusual to me that Australian citizens are prepared to share information with commercial enterprises quite freely and without reserve. And yet when it comes to sharing information with governments, which have all sorts of constraints around them and accountabilities that are not necessarily present in the commercial sector, that they're willing to share, they object to governments having information that they're sharing.
That's an issue of trust, isn't it?
It is. It's an issue of trust. And also it then becomes a terrific legislative challenge. I mentioned right at the beginning the issue of legislation. How do you legislate in such a way that intelligence agencies have got the necessary oversight to protect the citizens? Because, I mean, you don't want to be preying on your citizens. You've got the citizenry has to be protected from its government. I spent a lot of time in my time as the Director General working with the Attorney General's Department, with the Attorneys General, working with the states and territories, trying to work through this issue of precisely what the legislative framework should be to protect citizens, but at the same time allow the intelligence agencies to move with the times. Because there is intelligence out there in much of the data which is being held by individuals. And so how do you access that without compromising the liberties and the freedoms of the individual?
Can you do that? I mean, that at the end of the day, if the pendulum is going to swing one way or the other, is it necessary in your view that it swings more towards the intelligence and enhancement of security and surveillance and increasing surveillance rather than protection of those liberties? We've seen this played out in the media, for instance, with concerns about freedom of reporting, reporters being raided and prosecuted or potentially prosecuted as a result of that. If indeed decisions are to be made at these times of heightened fears, security, COVID, does the weight then fall more on the side of increasing powers of security and intelligence than it does on protecting freedom of speech or free media or the rights of individuals?
Stan, I'm very much glass half full with this argument. I think it can be settled. Each time you pass a legislative measure, it's contested. Where it proves to be excessive or inappropriate, it'll be redressed and addressed in due course. There is enough oversight, there is enough commentary, there is enough public involvement, if you like, in those decisions, I think, to land it. Now, it will be dynamic through time. I don't think you ever sort of settle and say, right, we now have an unchangeable and incontrovertible relationship between the individual and the state. I think that moves through time, and sometimes it moves backwards and forwards. But look, I am glass half full on this. But I must say that if an intelligence agency, and my own was a glaring example of this, is being given additional authorities, that must be accompanied with additional and corresponding oversight. I mean, that is what we are trying to protect at the end of the day. They're the values and the liberties that we are trying to protect. And if you have a look at our system here in Australia of oversight, and John mentioned the parliamentary committee that they have in the United Kingdom, the Intelligence Committee that, as he says, didn't exist some years ago. You know, we've got laminates now, providing oversight over the Australian intelligence community, and particularly ASIO, of the Parliament, ministerial oversight, the Parliamentary Joint Committee, the Inspector General of Intelligence, the Inspector of National Security Legislation. The list goes on. There's a half a dozen laminates before you get to the media and the public, which are also part of the scrutinising mechanism over the intelligence agencies.
So, John, you may want to say something about transparency, secrecy, and trust, and I hope you do. But could I also, there's a terrific question that's come in here that I think we could also look at, and this fits in with the change of technology, greater capacity, and that is how intelligence is collected, how that is changing, how that's going to change into the future. If you could address that, and perhaps any comments you have about questions of public trust in intelligence and questions of transparency and secrecy.
Okay, well, first of all, if I could just say on the COVID point, yes, we had extraordinary sort of limitations placed upon our movements and so on during the lockdown period, certainly in the UK, and in a slightly different way, but also very much still continuing, as I understand, in Australia. But it's important to remember that it was voluntary. The vast, the national response and people's response was a voluntary one. There was no capability on the part of the authorities really to enforce it. And we watched police activity here in the UK or in the country and aside and so on, so where I was. I mean, it was minimal, and I'm sure that it was the same with you. So something like that does depend upon voluntary adherence. I think this question of oversight and legislation is really important because I think I'm right in saying with Australia, but certainly in the UK, it's quite interesting to see how, despite all the questions that come up and all the challenges and so on and so forth, a clear majority, across public opinion, as it were, is supportive of and basically trusting of the security and intelligence community. And that's partly a historical thing and so on. You can go on about it, but it's linked into a sort of sense, I think, even if people don't know the detail, that it's a law-based state and the activities are law-based. And it's the development and the continuing development of our oversight mechanism, which is vastly more sophisticated, as Duncan was saying, than it was even 20, 30 years ago. And of course, it's partly the Oversight Committee, but that's only one part of it. In Parliament, it's much greater judicial involvement. The Investigatory Powers Act of 2016 has been really important in that respect in the UK, and it's enhanced judicial involvement. And that has created, and it continues to create, a system where, the oversight mechanisms help to, in effect, legitimize the activities of the service. They're a key part of that, quite complicated, trusting arrangement. And the instinct within society, and I may be a bit optimistic here, but the instinct in society is basically to be trusting. I mean, we don't, as a country, have a history or a past history of state abuse and state interference and dictatorship or anything like that. And it's quite interesting to see how, so therefore, the instincts with us, and I think probably in Australia too, are different. And I often discuss it with American colleagues because, of course, their constitution was a pushback against state control, which had something to do with the British, if I understood it correctly, at the time. And so the instinct within US society and so on is to be much more challenging, much more questioning, and much more disbelieving, really, of the good faith and the good nature of the intelligence community. But I don't think that does work with us. And it's very important that we understand that we respect it, and that the services themselves really work with it. And actually, in my experience, they do. We were never, we always were very keen to develop that properly and work within it, because that is our objective.
And how do you think that intelligence gathering and sharing and analysis is going to change into the future?
Well, of course, we touched on the way in which intelligence gathering will change. There we're into
artificial intelligence, technology.
Well, it's the explosion of data, which is at the sort of base of it. There's a massive increase in terms of the amount of information which is out there. When we talk about data now, but in a way, we're talking about information, intelligence, and whatever. And so, I mean, what I used to call open source as opposed to secret source. I mean, now open source availability is just totally transformed. And of course, that has to be, when you're giving advice to governments, you're giving advice to policymakers, you're trying to make sure that it's based on accurate information and so on. It's got to take account of really clear and sophisticated and honest analysis of a vast amount of information which is out there. And given the scale of it, I mean, of course, that means that you're using AI, your machine learning, you're using technology as it continues to advance, big time. And therefore, you have to, as I think Duncan said earlier, that's got to reflect itself in the way, the sort of people you have working for you, the skills that you have, and all the rest of it. And that's pretty well transformed and is transforming all the time. And our leaders of our community now talk about that the whole time. It's on their minds the whole time. At the same time, old-fashioned human intelligence, sources, are not going to go away. One of the big issues, going back to history again, 1945, people were saying, well, the experience with Bletchley Park and the breaking of German codes and the Enigma story and all the rest of it shows that in the future, everything is going to be SIGINT, it's going to be technical. And it's turned out to be a combination of the two, of course. And that's still the case.
Yeah, the human element is still quick. Can I just, the few minutes we have, let's talk about terrorism. If we were having this conversation, Duncan, 3 years ago at the height of ISIS, this would have been about ISIS and not China. It gives you an indication how much things have changed. But you've said this, that after you departed your role, you warned that ISIL's loss of territory in Iraq and Syria did not eliminate the global threat of Islamic extremism. And you can certainly see, can't you, ISIS very strong in parts of Africa, in the Sahel. It infiltrates other organizations. There have been ISIS activity in places like Afghanistan, in Southeast Asia. How much of a threat does this remain? Is there a fear of complacency because it's not at the front of mind right now, not on the front pages?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, I stand very much by the comments that I made at the time, that this is an enduring threat, and while the military solution, if you like, was kind of arrived at with the dissolving of the caliphate, the so-called caliphate. The idea lives on, and the idea is infectious, and it's a bit like COVID in a way. It spreads easily. It has been knocked off the front page by events. Obviously, both the great power rivalries that we've been talking about, and more recently with the events of COVID, climate change. We haven't talked about that at all tonight. I noticed there are some questions.
To touch on that. Yeah,
there are some questions about that. But look, terrorism remains a threat. A point you made a moment ago when you were asking John about what's changed in terms of how we share intelligence. One of the things that terrorism did in this country was to create a situation where the domestic intelligence agency, the Security Intelligence Agency, ASIO, was sharing with the Australian public, either through its own information passage or through police forces or through governments, information which would have been unthinkable in years gone by, because we had never in this country had a domestic threat in the way that we had. I mean, we had Australians going off to fight overseas for this rogue cause. This is cutting new ground. How did we protect ourselves? So we were sharing, and I think we will continue in the future to share information with the community at rates that we have not done in the past. It doesn't undermine the fact there'll still be secrets. I mean, there will always be secrets. It's a fact of the human condition. But intelligence agencies will be sharing more than they have in the past. The climate change issue, I worry about the kind of intersection of now the economic crisis that the globe faces. There's no question about this. I mean, it's agonizing to watch where we're going economically. And it seems to me that one of the kind of short-term solutions to this is to start walking away from some of the climate change initiatives and commitments that we
of course,
really
the United States pulled out of Paris Accords.
There you go. So I think we need to make sure we keep our eye on the prize here, and we don't actually lose the sight of what is required to address the climate change issue in what are going to be quite stricken economic times.
And I think that could apply, Sir John, to everything, couldn't it? When we are going through such enormous upheaval, we know that economic upheaval leads to enormous social change, political change. If we go back again to the lessons of history, if not the repetition of history, then certainly you can see what the Depression of 1929, 1930 did to the rise of fascism, for instance, across Europe. With that economic uncertainty, with a health threat, with the rise of China, with declining democracy, with increasing authoritarianism, with an ongoing threat of terrorism and a climate challenge, is there just so much happening here that it becomes almost impossible to deal with? We're feeling a bit overwhelmed right now as a globe, aren't we?
Well, yes, and we probably are as individuals too, which makes that quite difficult to answer. I think my sort of overarching, and I want to come back to the terrorism a bit, because I think we probably do need just briefly to say something a bit more about that. My overwhelming sort of worry, if you like, is the degree to which confidence in government has been undermined, or may be undermined when we look back on this, because there have been so many, even in countries where we think that the crisis has been quite well handled. When you actually go there, or you read about it, you feel, well, not sure, a lot of criticism. So we have to think through what that's going to mean at some point into the future. But if I'm looking for something which is particularly at risk as a result of COVID, I would actually highlight extremist and potentially terrorist activity. I think it's fairly easy to see the connection there. I mean, I know that questions are asking, well, ISIS still exists, and you've been saying IS still exists. And
well,
so
it was always
with
Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they were always ideas, weren't they? They were as much, I mean, they established a caliphate with a flag in the ground for a period, but the idea was so virulent, and that's what was able to attract so many people.
Well, and then, of course, at the most basic point, the numbers are still there. I mean, the latest estimate is roughly in Iraq and Syria, 14 to 18,000 IS fighters are still there. They're still active, and of course, to some extent, they're taking advantage of the contagion, the fear of contagion, the limitation on movements, the limitation of allied forces moving around, and particularly in Iraq and so on. So, you've got that point, and it certainly would be a mistake to think that that issue has been solved. But there's also the wider radicalization point. After all, our experience the last few years has been more and more that it's technological sort of background has opened up the path to individual radicalization process, where individuals just become radicalized online. And what are they doing? They're sitting in their rooms, listening and being radicalized. Well, what's been going on in the last few months? An awful lot of people sitting in their rooms online. And we don't yet know, what effect that's going to have. But from a security service point of view, I think I'm right in saying that is particularly difficult to anticipate and to support the individual self-radicalized terrorists. After all, on the July the 14th, 2016 Bastille Day, I think 84 people were killed by one individual on the Promenade des Anglais in Nice. It's just, that's what can happen. It's almost impossible to predict. And that's 4 years ago, and pre-COVID. So there's really quite, and the number of people being referred to counter-radicalization programs in the UK and so on have gone down markedly since the beginning of the lockdown and so on. I could go on. So if we're choosing a particular area to worry about, I'd say it should be that. It'll come back.
And indeed, just a final thought on this before we go as well, Duncan. We've been talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever form of Islamic-based terrorism, but of course there are other threats, and you've identified right-wing ethno-supremacist extremism as well, and we've seen a rise in Europe of the far right, and we saw, of course, those horrible events in New Zealand in Christchurch, Duncan. So what is your assessment of that threat, Duncan, right now as well, given all the political uncertainty, the economic uncertainty, which we know fuels political extremism?
I think that largely will follow the same path as those concerns that John just mentioned with Islamist terrorism. I mean, in our own societies, these extreme sort of right-wing ethno-supremacist views thrive on the kind of circumstances that we are experiencing as a community right now. And so I would be quite worried about, and I know, look, the intelligence services are very much aware of this. They've been following it You know, we were accused at one stage of, oh, you've only just come back to this issue. We've been following right-wing extremist sort of ethno-supremacist organisations for the last 40 or 50 years in Australia. There's nothing new about that. But I think we need to be very, very careful, because the seeds for those things to prosper are in the ground now in our communities, and we need to be very, very careful of it.
Yeah, look, it's been an absolute pleasure. We've filled that hour and a half. We could fill another hour and a half. Absolutely. It's been fantastic. I want to thank you to everyone who's tuned in to this conversation. Thank you for your comments and your questions. We were able to incorporate so many of those themes throughout this conversation. Duncan Lewis, been a pleasure to see you, and Sir John Scarlett as well. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Dan.
you.